Hello, everyone. I'm seeing that people have already started to flow very quickly into the room. So I just wanted to start off by saying good morning to anyone who's only just joining us, and for anyone who's been with us since day one, hello again. I know it's been a very long and fruitful event, but we just want to say thank you so much for being here for this panel in particular, which is very near and dear to my heart, and is something that F.O.R.M is really decolonization, and decolonization within open science is a topic that F.O.R.M is really interested in digging deeper into and learning more about, and finding out how we can contribute to the decolonization of open science. So I just want to start off again by welcoming everyone and just doing some quick housekeeping right before we get started. Our panelists are all here today and they're very excited to share their insights with you. So I'll try to make sure not to speak for too much longer. But so just some housekeeping, it's the usuals. Please use the chat to introduce yourselves, to let us know where you're coming from. We love to know who is engaging with us. And also, if you have any technical issues, if you can't hear us, if you are struggling with anything related to like Zoom technicalities, please do use the chat so that we can help you as fast as possible. If you have questions, and I hope you do, and I hope that this is a very engaged group of people that are here with us today, please don't be shy. We're all here to be a part of this bigger conversation. If there is any question on your mind, please do share it with us on the Q&A box. It's the button down here in the toolbar. It's right directly in the center of Zoom. So please do use that to share your feedback or questions with us. Also, I just wanted to let anyone know who might be joining us from the Arab region or who is an Arabic speaker and is perhaps more comfortable in speaking in Arabic or expressing their views in Arabic. We do actually have an Arabic interpreter who is joining us in the back end, and she will be monitoring the chat and the questions as well. So, excuse me, please, if you do want to share something but feel a bit uncomfortable, would rather express it in your own language, that it's what this panel is all about. It's about acknowledging that there is academic language and insights to be shared in multiple languages and from multiple parts of the world. So please do take advantage of it and know that you are welcome to express your views in whatever language you're comfortable in. Unfortunately, we don't have interpreters for every language in the world, we wish, but at least we're starting off with Arabic, which is relevant for F.O.R.M. Okay, so I've talked a lot. We are going to actually now begin. I want to first welcome a very exciting speaker for us who actually joined us as well last year. So we're so excited to have you, Dr. Danny Kingsley. Dr. Danny is an Australian-based thought leader in the international scholarly communication space. She took up the position of community manager of the Southern Hemisphere at OAPEN in August 2023. So congratulations for the recent promotion. She has consulted for multiple Australian universities since returning from the UK, where she worked as the Deputy Director of Cambridge University Libraries from 2015 to 2019. And she's going to be sharing with us a very interesting paper. So please do join me in welcoming Dr. Danny in the chat, and pay attention because she definitely is going to have a lot to say that we all need to learn a lot from. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nahil. And thank you, everybody, for coming along. And thank you to the organisers for inviting me. I'd just like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people here in what is called Meanjin in the traditional language, which we call Brisbane in Australia. It's quite warm here because we're moving into summer. So you should see my slides. It looks like you can. And so today I'm talking to you in my capacity as community manager for the Directory of Open Access Books and OAPEN. And I've got the bracket Southern Hemisphere in there, but it actually means everything that isn't Europe and the Americas. So that southern hemisphere includes the Middle East and all the other parts of the northern hemisphere that are not Europe and the Americas. So it's quite a big undertaking, and it's one I'm feeling slightly overwhelmed about, and I'm asking for your help, in fact. So let's get started. Move the slides forward. There we are. So today I'm going to be talking about the organisations and also be talking about what we mean when we talk about open access books. Also talk about where the money comes from in terms of funding, and issues, which is obviously the focus of what we're wanting to try and uncover this particular Open Access Week, where we're talking about community over commercialisation, about what our communities are, and the question of language and cultural diversity, and then finishing up with an appeal, a call out to you as our community. And this is a photograph of our first all-staff in-person meeting that was held in August. And here we are in Denmark together in front of it's a castle, in fact, in Denmark. And it's just a nice photo of all of us. And for most of us, we were meeting each other for the first time, face to face. For myself and one of the other members in the middle at the back, Geordie, we had just started with the organisation. So we were very much meeting everybody new. So let's start with this question of OAPEN and the Directory of Open Access Books. So OAPEN, I should say, was an acronym. So each of the letters stood for a different word. But one of those words, the E, was European, and we now want to be global. So we've decided to keep the name OAPEN, but not use it as an acronym anymore, just use it as a word that's slightly odd that we're going to need to explain every time. So the OAPEN Foundation is a not-for-profit and not-for-sale foundation. So in the governance of the organisation, part of the rules of the organisation says that we are unable to be bought out. And this was a discussion that came up today at a different Open Access Week event I attended, where there was that sense of betrayal that some people have about what start up as community organisations that then get bought out by larger commercial companies. OAPEN and the Directory of Open Access Books are not able to be bought out by their structure. So the idea is that we are a community resource and that we increase the discoverability of open access books. And part of our mission is to promote and build trust in open access publishing. And we do that in a transparent and open way, and we're driven by our community. So the OAPEN Library is part of the foundation, which hosts and distributes over 30,000 open access books, and they come from many, many publishers around the world. We also have the Directory of Open Access Books, and that's an index of books. So the OAPEN Library hosts the books. You can go and download the book from OAPEN. Whereas if you go to the Directory of Open Access Books, it will send you to where the book is. Now, in some cases, that will be OAPEN Library, but in other cases, it might be to, say, the MIT Press or wherever the book is hosted. So it's linked out to over 70, actually it's gone up to 75,000 in the few days since I put these slides together. We're now over 75,000 peer-reviewed open access books. And we also have a new service, a relatively new service, which is the Open Access Books Toolkit. And that's aimed at authors to give them information and resources on, if you want to publish an open access book, how to go about doing that. So the library was launched in 2010. And we now have 4,000 plus publishers, and some of those numbers are what I was just referring to. But you can see here down at the bottom a graph that indicates over time since 2014, so nearly 10 years worth of data that's talking about the collection and how much has been added over time. And you can see it was fairly flat originally, and we are working, it's exponentially increasing, which is fantastic. So we haven't quite finished yet. Year 2023, so we're hoping that the light blue gets a bit higher and that we have even more by the end of the year. We've still got a couple of months to go. So the library is based on DSpace, so it's a repository, and we also offer integration with library catalogues in multiple different metadata fields, depending on what metadata field your library system is using. This is a map of the downloads across the world of the material that is in our OAPEN library. And you can see by the density of colour that there's a heavy use in America and in some parts of Europe, but there is also use in many other countries. In fact, I think except for Antarctica, every continent and country is represented here. And it's interesting to look at where there are really more intense areas of focus, including in South Africa and India as well. And quite a lot of work in Indonesia. Indonesia is a very enthusiastic user of open access resources and producer of them too. So because we are indexed, you can look at our downloads and clicks from services like Ex Libris, which is a library cataloging system. Sorry, a bit blank there. So when we're embedded into library systems, it means that the university users or the users of that library system don't have to go somewhere else to find the books. So they can click through and use the open access books through their own library catalogue. And this gives you an indication of what kind of downloads we have. So the orange is the directory of open access books, and the dark blue is OAPEN, and the light blue is the full text of OAPEN. So they're the clicks. So once you get to the full text, the light blue is the download, basically. And you can see that this is just over a year's worth. We've got a very large, hundreds of thousands of downloads and clicks coming through from there, which is fantastic because, of course, this is free for the university and for the user. So the Directory of Open Access Books, it's 10 years for us. So we're celebrating our 10-year-old birthday. And it's a curated index. So we do ensure, we go through a process when a publisher wants to put a book into the Directory of Open Access Books, to put the metadata of a book into the directory. We go through a peer-reviewed process to ensure that this is a publisher that is producing peer-reviewed books of quality. And then when they're not putting just rubbish in there. So there is a something of a stamp of authority of books in the Directory of Open Access Books. And as I said, we've got 75,000 now, and we actually co-manage the Directory of Open Access Books with an organisation called Open Edition. It's also in DSpace. So we provide open infrastructure. And so this is a bit of a confusing graph, but you can see that you've got on the left-hand side players in the field like publishers, small and large, that send both the books and the metadata into OAPEN and the metadata only into the Directory of Open Access Books. And that's then sent through various forms like search engines or non-commercial aggregators or library aggregators, like what I was just describing, like Ex Libris, into libraries and directly to readers. So it's a way of us pulling all of that together to get the information from the publishers to the readers in the end. So let's talk about what we mean by an open access book. So I'm going to show you just a couple of examples of books, and these are just screen grabs from the library, from OAPEN library. So this is a book called Population Change in Europe, the Middle East and North Africa. And you can see that there's a image of the front cover of the book, so you know what it looks like. And there's an abstract, there's URL there. We've got some keywords that help you search for it. And there's also, I've had to crop this to bring it into the one slide. You'd have to normally roll down to be able to see these statistics. And you can see that this book's been downloaded in 2021, 42 times, in 2022, 60 times, and so far in 2023, about 28 times. But also what's interesting is where these people are coming from. So you can see here that this is the largest big swirl here is Europe, and then after that, Asia. And then we've got North America, and then Africa, and then South America and Oceania. So there's actually a really wide interest in this area, this particular subject of population change in these three areas. Then if we go to another book that is focused on the MENA area, it's talking about the MENA region. It was written a bit earlier. It was written in 2019. And you can see that there was 100 downloads in 2020, 200 in 2021, 120 or so in 2022, and so far we're up to about just under 100 in 2023. And in this one, there's even more interest from Europe. So the last book did have some European content. This one is specifically only about the MENA region, and interestingly, there's a higher European read here. But again, Asia is very interested. So that kind of information about where books are being read is really valuable for us to understand who's reading what and where. So an advantage of an open access book is that there is a clear increased readership and usage and citation of open access books. So I'm going to talk in overall numbers here. So we looked at two that have reasonable downloads, not enormous ones, but reasonable ones. The general consensus is that with a published printed physical monograph, that it is considered to be doing well if it sells 200 copies. And the cost of those is often very, very high. It's often well beyond the resource of most researchers, and particularly researchers who don't have a lot of resources available to them. So the readership of physical monographs is not particularly high compared to the readership of open access monographs, which can be extremely high depending on the work. It can be tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of downloads. And it's fairly obvious that if something is freely available and you don't have a very high price point, it's much more accessible to the broader community. So having it just out there in the public domain is one thing. We do need to make sure that we have that infrastructure that I described earlier, which is all of the arrows, to be able to get it from being out in the wild into places where people can find them easily, hence the OAPEN library, hence the directory, and us pushing that information into libraries' databases so that people can find them. It means that the work has got a real world impact and engagement. It's available right from that moment of being made online and is able to be shared and read at that point. And there's also greater author control. It sounds counterintuitive, but more author control when you have an open access book that you can determine where it's going to be made available. You can also make changes if needed to the book once it's been released. That's in updates or slight amendments if necessary. It's very, very agile. That's a word we like these days. So this isn't free, okay? So we need to think about who pays for the books, open access books. So one model is a sort of reflection of the article processing charges that are available in journal publishing. So you pay for a particular article to be made openly accessible. So a book processing charge is a model that is existing at the moment in commercial publishing. And you can see here that I've got three different publishers here. You've got Taylor & Francis, Intech, OAPEN, and Cambridge University Press. And they all charge around the 10,000 mark. So for Taylor & Francis, it's £10,000, which translates to about 12,500 American dollars. Intech, again, £10,000. Cambridge University Press, £10,500. And it's a lot of money. That's for a monograph. And then for a chapter, then we've got around the 1,500 euro cost. So this is well beyond the capability of many academics. Mind you, if you're paying a Nature article processing charge, it's about this £10,000 monograph amount, but that's another argument. So what about people who don't have that kind of money lying around? So one of the analyses that's been done, this was a white paper that was done in 2018 and then updated in 2021, that was saying, well, one of the benefits of this model is that it does give recognition to that there are costs associated with quality publishing, that if you're putting a peer-reviewed publication, an edited book online, there is work associated with that, and that work costs money. So there are benefits that this model at least does raise that to the fore. But obviously, in the arts, humanities and social sciences, and in a lot of areas around the world, there are not the financial resources to support this sort of publishing. And then we've got an unfair environment. And this is disadvantaging a really large group of scholars. So pros, yes, there are some many more cons. And there was a study that came out in 2017, a couple of years before, that was looking at the landscape of open access monographs. And they were saying that actually the funding problem, people saying, well, we don't have that kind of money lying around, is not because there's a scarcity of money, but the money is not being employed efficiently. So we need to think about changing the way we actually look at the amount of money in this ecosystem. So there are many, many alternative models. And what we have here are only a few examples. So we can see a variety of business models that include things like book processing charges, which is what we've just been discussing, but things like institutional subsidies. So that might be direct to open or flip it open. And there's also subscribe to open. So institutions might commit some money to making a particular book openly accessible. And once enough institutions have committed into the funds, that book is flipped and it becomes open access for everybody. So there's different ways that different institutions can contribute in and find ways to support an open access publishing model that doesn't necessarily involve the author trying to scrounge around and find out of nowhere €10,500. There are also collaborative funding models. So the Open Book Collective is relatively new. And what it's trying to do is collect open access book publishers and infrastructures and service providers together. And so libraries can say, we've got some money at the end of the year for in our budget that we want to spend, and we're choosing to support some open initiatives. And so the library can put some money into the Open Book Collective, and it can allocate which infrastructures it wants to specifically support, or it can just put some money into the Open Book Collective. And this is a very valuable resource, because I was part of a discussion a couple of weeks ago with many of the people on the previous slide and people from the Open Book Collective. And we were just trying to map out the processes and where we will fit into the different parts of the research life cycle. And we were using a Miro board online. And it really, by the end, looked like somebody had just thrown a whole lot of Post-it notes randomly at a page. It's really complex, and we need to try and simplify this area of open support. And the Open Book Collective is a really good start for that. So the Director of Open Access Books published a guest post earlier this year, in June this year, and it was looking at this question of global equity for open access books. And what we noted there was that we've still got a main population of publishers from Europe and North America. There is some growth from South America, and part of that is because we have got a trusted publishing or trusted partner arrangement with CLO. And so that is a way of us being able to work with them to really try and unearth a large quantity of South American publications. But we don't yet have that kind of arrangement with publishers from Africa and Asia. And that's my role. That's partly what I've been brought on to the organisation to try and find and work. And so we've got, particularly on journals, particularly in Asia and particularly in Indonesia, there's a lot of busy, open access is really exploding. It's incredibly impressive what's happening there. And we're wondering why they're not using the Directory of Open Access Books. It might be they don't know about it. And it might be that there are other things at stake. And so part of my role as a community manager is to start working with the community to understand what are the issues and what will help. Who do I need to talk to? Who can I connect together to make these sorts of things? We wanted the books from the other parts of the world to be more well surfaced. On the question of the English versus non-English material in our both OAPEN and DOAB, the Directory of Open Access Books is slightly better. It's got 42% of its material is in a language other than English. And that's partly because of that relationship we have with CLO. In the OAPEN library, we're not doing as well. It's only 35%, so it's just over a third. And of course, while the lingua franca is often English, we know that actually the majority of people who are working as academics in the world do not have English as their first language. We are working on a project with the Directory of Open Access Books in Africa, and we're trying to do some addressing the publisher's equitable access to open access distribution channels and discovery services. And we're also working with Open Book Futures on this issue. So when we look at the languages, we've got, and I only did a shot of the first few, so there's not much diversity in these ones. So we can see we've got Afrikaans and Albanian and Amharic and Arabic. So there's 13 books in Arabic at the moment in the OAPEN library. And we've got there are some other languages that are listed in the Directory of Open Access books. So a research paper that was published just recently is about what is in our library and who is reading them, found that there is a global interest in books with regional focus. So a couple of those books that I showed you earlier are books that have a regional focus, and there is, as you could see, global interest in them. In many countries, the 10 most downloaded books are written in languages other than English. And even if it is English language title, they're often talking about regional concerns. So we want to really delve into that a bit more and start really engaging more with regional focus from local books. So our plan is to engage with publishers in other parts of the world, and we recognise that requires special language skills and knowledge about publishing practices. So it's part of obviously what I'm trying to do, and we want coordination within the directory to manage a global directory. And of course, while our team speaks multiple languages, we don't speak all of them by any stretch. So we do need to partner with people who do have a local connection who can work with us to help us doing that vetting process and reassuring our readers that the books are of quality. So just a quick description of our Directory of Open Access book in Africa project. It's 2 years. We're working on a shoestring, and it's really about awareness raising and engagement. We're doing some training in terms of evaluating the applications of books coming through to be indexed. And we're wanting to look at having an ambassadors program inspired by our sort of sister organisation, the Directory of Open Access Journals. We've got a continental platform in Africa, which is something that we are about to sign a memorandum of agreement on it, or a memorandum of understanding. And we're looking at how they can engage in some outreach activities. So this is that's the continental platform here. And so it's going to add to the existing partners. I've already mentioned Open Edition. We've got JSTOR and CLO. And so having the trusted platform with the continental platform should mean that we can start bringing African material, African books into the Directory of Open Access books, and possibly also into the OAPEN library. So coming to our group here, I'm the new community manager. We want to understand how we can help publishers and libraries in Asia and the Middle East. And we want to think about having representatives from Asia and the Middle East on our boards. That's an active discussion we're having right now. And we're also looking to diversify the financial support of both OAPEN and the Directory of Open Access books. So we want to hear from you. So they are my contact details there. And if you're a publisher, a library funder, an organisation, or really, even if you're just an author that's interested in publishing an open access book, please get in touch. That's my job, and I really do want to hear from you. And that's everything I have to say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dani, for a very, very, very insightful presentation. And thank you for exposing all of us to OAPEN and all of its hard work to try and bring in more of the world when it comes to scholarly communications and publishing and open access as a whole. Next up, we're going to be hearing from Saurabh. I hope I got your name right. Sorry. So Saurabh Khanna is a junior research fellow at Pembroke College, University of Oxford. He completed his PhD in education policy and computer science at Stanford University, where he was a fellow at the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Very, very interesting, especially in this day and age, and a scholar at Standard Data Science. So without further ado, I am handing over the mic to Saurabh.
Thanks, Nahil. It's great to be here and to continue the conversation started by Dr. Kingsley here about open access. Um, I will be speaking about some work that I have done as a PhD student and now as a research scholar with the Public Knowledge Project. And this will be about recalibrating the scope of scholarly publishing. Uh, Let me just start with some background on the current narrative that we saw around scholarly publishing, which is when we started conceiving of an idea for this research. Around 2018, there was this paper by Altbach and DeWitt, which mentioned that too much research is being published. There was a number also thrown around suggesting that there are around 30,000 scientific journals, and it was said that there is this overpublication, which is putting pressure on top journals and leading to a rise of lower quality publishers. And all in all, there was this call for a reduction in research publication. And there was another narrative that we also wanted to acknowledge when we started on this project was that there is definitely a post-colonial struggle in academic publishing. Institutions that are in the global south definitely face challenges in terms of the amount of resources they have, the amount of visibility of research that they have, and there is always these academic dependencies, as we call it, which essentially means that if you have a very good article and you are a researcher in, say, somewhere in South Asia, then you have this struggle between trying to publish in an open access journal which identifies with your own context versus a journal which is reputed and centered in the Western world, and has more academic currency, as they say. So you have to navigate that balance all the time as a researcher. Um, and the narrative itself also says that peripheral universities, essentially, they are called in many papers, which are considered to be dependent on central institutions for direction. Um, Given this current framing that we saw in previous literature, we wanted to say that despite the challenges that have been highlighted and do exist, there are a lot of researchers in the global south who do leverage open access publishing platforms very effectively, which means that there is an urgent need to decentralize academia from its Western focus. And recognizing and realizing the full potential of the research universe that we have is going to shift and enrich the academic discourse for everyone and not just for researchers in the global south. And it was this motivation and this narrative of underrepresented researchers which is highlighted in our research. um, I will be speaking to you today about three dimensions of diversity in research output that we saw while analyzing data. And those will be diversity around geography, diversity around language, and diversity along discipline. And it's going to be building on some of the things that we heard Dr. Kingsley speak about just a bit ago. So let me start with the data that we have for all of this research. Um, we are working with Open Journal Systems, which is the Public Knowledge Project's flagship software, which lets you host a journal or a journal installation at no cost to yourself. And this software has a back end which is called the PKP beacon, which is essentially providing security patches or software upgrades to all these journal administrators. Uh, One thing that the beacon also has is that it transmits essential indexing information about the journal. So this is the data, or this is the beacon pings that we are getting from all the journals that are using OJS across the world, and this is what we are leveraging to look at the numbers. We only look at a subset of journals using OJS, which publish at least 5 articles per year. And this is a threshold we have set in line with DOAJ standards to look at active journals. And in the year 2020, when we were analyzing this data, we had 25,671 journals across the globe which were meeting this standard of being an active journal. And I must say that as of December 2022, towards the end of last year, this number was much higher and closer to 34,000. But going back to the 2020 data, which we were analyzing in the paper, we had journals which published almost 1 million articles in 2020, and cumulatively a total of more than 5 million articles since their inception. And all this data that I'm going to, and the results that I'm going to show you, they are public with our paper. So let me start with the first dimension of diversity, which is the geographic diversity. So before identifying geographic diversity, how do we even know a journal's country of origin? So we followed a 3-step process to identify where a journal is located. And so if the first step fails, we go to step 2. If the second step fails, we go to step 3. So the first step is essentially we use the journal ISSN and the log ISSN lookup API, which maps each ISSN to a mark code. And then that mark code can be mapped to a country. We found most of the country values using this first step. But if this step fails and doesn't give us a value, we move to the second step where we are mapping the top level domains from journal URLs to their ISO 3166 codes. So for instance, if a journal is ending with .in, there is a possibility that this journal is hosted on an Indian server and is in India. If this also does not give us an answer, because some of the journals have URLs like .com or .org, we take the IP address that's associated with the URL and try to geolocate the journal using the free GeoLite to geolocation data available from MaxMind. So we have this 3-step process to identify as many countries as possible for all the journals that are using OJS actively. And the result is this global distribution of journals using OJS across 136 countries across the globe. And you can see on this map, the intensity of the color is telling you how many journals were active in that country in the year 2020. So we see there are definitely some hotspots. So we have hotspots around Southeast Asia. We have them around India, then definitely in Latin America around Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and we also have the US as well. It's interesting to look at the distribution when we see the top 10 nations. You can see that Indonesia is one of the big users, and this was also referred to in the previous conversation by Dr. Kingsley, and Brazil as well. So taken together, Indonesia and Brazil form more than half the journals that are actively using OJS. And this is not surprising for us, because Indonesia has been often cited as an open access success story. This is an article that came in Nature, I think around 3 years ago, which was telling us that more than 80% of journal articles that were published in Indonesia in the year 2017 were made available as open access articles, which is much higher than the second country, I think, which is Colombia. So Indonesia topping this chart significantly is not a surprise to us. Another thing to look at in the global distribution is the regions of the world and how they are represented. So you can see that Western Europe and other states around Western Europe only have around 14% representation. So we have a lot of journals from Asia Pacific. We have a lot of representation from Latin America because of Brazil and Argentina, as we saw in the map. And you can see that a lot of regions that are not commonly available in mainstream research indexes are coming out in this research repository with open journal systems. And another thing that we looked at was the economic and geopolitical distribution. So this is an interesting one as well, where we find that only around 18.7 or 19% journals are hosted in high income nations. So roughly 81% of these journals are coming from nations which are middle or low income nations, which is significant because it shows that OJS is essentially uh, becoming a source for these researchers to publish their research without going through the hoops that we have in mainstream research indexes. I'm going to talk about the second dimension now, which is the linguistic diversity of these journals. Um, so again, before I go into linguistic diversity, how do we even identify the language? So the way we do this is we use Google's Compact Language Detector, or GCLD3. We use it on the 100 most recent published articles for a given journal. And the labels are assigned based on multiple languages, and the most frequent language classification is assigned as the journal's primary language of publishing. We also have another nuance here, that if the article has abstracts which are classified in more than one language, we assign that journal a multilingual designation, which means that it can have articles in more than one language. And I'll speak soon about this part. We also ran heuristic checks for all the languages that we saw in the data. So if you look at our paper, we also have samples in terms of journals and their URLs for all the languages that we have seen visible on journals using OJS. So coming to the diversity part now, we see that research is being published on journals using OJS in at least 60 languages, and we found samples for all these 60 languages in the paper. It's not surprising that 50% of the articles are being published in English, but the surprising part is that in comparison, if you look at mainstream indexes like Scopus, which has publication in 40 languages, but at the same time, the English proportion is close to 93%, which is much lower in our OJS corpus, highlighting that there's much larger linguistic diversity. And the language classifications that we had come out of this project were also then shared with Google Scholar to enable these journals to be indexed widely if you search for specific research topics on Scholar. This is the distribution of the top 10 languages. Again, as we have, as you see, English around 50% is the top one, followed by Indonesian, then Spanish and Portuguese. And these are the top four for us, which have a significant presence. So there's another interesting part, which I briefly alluded to previously, about multilingualism. We see that at least half the journals which are using OJS are publishing in more than one language, which was very interesting to us. And it essentially questions the research hegemony of English that we have, considering it as the language of science, when we have a lot of journals which are not just publishing in multiple languages, but also a single journal is publishing in two languages within itself, two or more. This is a more detailed plot of the multilingual aspect. So the way to interpret this is, so if I look at the second column, for instance, so this means that journals which are publishing in both Indonesian and English we have around 4,431 journals which have this multilingual aspect. And or if you look at English and Spanish, we have 1,763. So you can see that there's a broad range of multilingualism present within these journals. And again, I want to emphasize that this high linguistic diversity challenges the assumption that we have of English as the universal language of science. We need to recognize the detrimental effects this has on knowledge production. The fact that we are here speaking in English and conversing in English, writing in English, talking about research, slides in English, it is a detriment, and we need to acknowledge that as part of our research. And we have a call for the promotion of transnational scientific dialogue in diverse languages as part of our paper, keeping this shortcoming in mind. Let me come to the third part now, which is the disciplinary diversity. So for the disciplinary distribution of journals, we follow a similar approach to the language one. So we take the title and abstract of 5 most recent articles in ISS and verified journals, and we send these as inputs to a neural network, which classifies them into field of study labels according to the ANZSRC. So the broad takeaway here is that the distribution or disciplinary distribution has a significant proportion of social sciences and STEM, and also presence of humanities. If we look at a more granular breakdown, you see that there are many diverse disciplines in here. So we have medicine, we have engineering, education, law, economics, history, archaeology, mathematics. So you see that there's a lot of disciplines being covered by the journals using OJS. The fact, like one of the things that's visible here is that STEM fields led by medical and health sciences, followed by engineering and technology, have a major role as well. And this STEM presence, which is noteworthy in these journals, largely operating in the global south, they call for a globally distributed basis for STEM research, because a lot of papers in STEM fields are much more disproportionately coming from countries in the United States or Western Europe. So we need to acknowledge that there's considerable STEM research happening in these global south nations as well. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about is diversity in terms of visibility. So we have looked at geography, we have looked at language, we have looked at discipline. Now we want to understand how much of these journals are visible in all the mainstream research indexes like Google Scholar or Web of Science or Scopus. The motivation for this comes from the fact that previous research by Alonso Gamboa and Keto has, for instance, found that there was a significant marginalization of Global South research in mainstream indexes. For instance, taking the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, the Web of Science only covered 0.5% at the time of their study. And in response to this lack of coverage, LAT index was formed, which is currently actively indexing around 24,000 journals. So we assess the visibility of journals using OJS that we are looking at in our study across 11 research indexes. So these indexes are the ones we speak about often: the Web of Science, EBSCO, Scopus, Dimensions, OpenAlex, Google Scholar, DOAJ. And interestingly, we also look at the last two, which is the Cabell's predatory reports and the Beale's list. So these are essentially repositories which are classifying journals as potentially predatory journals. So it was interesting to look at this aspect as well, and how much of the journals that we have in the Global South overlap with the Beale's list or with the Cabell's predatory list. And the way we assess this overlap is by measuring, like mapping the journals across these indexes using the ISSN, using the URL, and using the journal domains. This is the main table with results from our paper, which talks about the visibility. And I want you to focus on the last column, which is OJS%. So it's essentially telling you how much of journals using OJS are available in Web of Science, for instance, or in Scopus or at Google Scholar. So we see that, um, interestingly and not surprisingly, Web of Science and EBSCO and Scopus have very little representation of these journals. It's less than 10%. And if you look at more recent journals, journal indexes like Dimensions or OpenAlex, they have a significantly better representation, but it's still, we have still around 30 to 40% shortfall. Google Scholar, as expected, has a much higher overlap with journals using OJS. And it's also an artifact of the fact that we have been actively working with Google Scholar to increase the visibility of this research on their platform. Another interesting thing to look at is the last two rows. You see that the journals using OJS have only 1% overlap with Cabell's predatory reports, and similarly 1.4% with the Beals list. So very few of these journals are overlapping with these predatory index lists. This coverage is interesting because there is a common assumption that when we look at scientometric or bibliometric studies in, say, Science or Nature or PNAS or all the top journals as they are classified, they often use these indexes and assume that these databases constitute the entire scientific universe. And the fact that more than 90% of journals which are coming from the global south are missing from these indexes is a big shortcoming. And this is something I spoke about already, that the more recent ones are actively indexing, but still there's a shortfall that needs to be covered. We also ran some preliminary analysis on citations. So how are these journals cited? And this is very preliminary and there's a lot of unanswered questions, but we are finding that given the multilingual aspect, a lot of English language articles that are on journals using OJS, for them, the citations are mostly coming from outside OJS. So non-OJS journals are citing a lot of English articles. But if you look at multilingualism from other languages perspectives, like Indonesian or Portuguese, most of the citations for these non-English languages are coming from inside OJS. So it's essentially within OJS, we have this multilingual universe where we have a lot of languages in which articles are being published, and there's a lot of in citation happening as well in this universe. This is something I alluded to. The predatory journals have often been asserted as a global threat, which is the framing that I began with, which was part of the conversation by Altbach and DeWitt. And it's often conflated with open access publishing, sadly, but here we are showing that more than or roughly 99% of the journals which are openly using OJS are not even overlapping. So we need to have a new approach to address the problem of predatory publishing, and we need to have better standards for the transparency of journal integrity. I want to conclude with some reflections here. So the estimates of global journal numbers to begin with are significantly understated. If we have more than 25,000 journals actively using OJS, it definitely means that we have a lot more journals overall in the universe of scientific research. Secondly, dismissing this research as predatory is unscientific, especially because we don't see any overlap with predatory lists in if we look at the data, and we need to recalibrate scholarly communication at a large scale. Thirdly, we saw a lot of bibliodiversity in the research that's coming from journals using OJS. Research was coming from 136 countries, most of them in the global south, publishing in at least 60 languages, and many of them are multilingual journals. And we have a broad range of disciplines from STEM to social sciences to the humanities. And we also want to acknowledge that this is a preliminary step in rescaling scholarly communication, and there's a lot of unanswered questions on the operation of journals using OJS within the larger world of research, which is why the entire data set that we use for this is public with our paper for validation by other researchers. And lastly, I want to say that a more global, diverse, and inclusive world of scholarly communication, it's not just a possibility that we should be aiming for, it's already underway, and we need to acknowledge it for humanity's benefit. And with that, I conclude my talk. And this is a link to our paper in case you wish to read it. And the QR code will also lead you to the paper. And thanks for giving me a chance to speak on this panel for our behalf. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saurabh. And you've definitely given us a lot of very interesting metrics and insights and a lot of quantifiable data that I hope a lot of people can walk away with and do something of value with. So next up, we have Dr. Joe Haverman, who has been able to join us, I see, at the last second. And I'm inviting you to turn on your camera and say hello to everybody while I introduce you. So Dr. Joe Haverman, with a background in evolution and developmental biology, she's a trainer and consultant in open scholarly communication and research project management, and the founder of Africa Archive. Her work experience covers NGOs, a science startup, and international institutions, including the UN Environment Programme, and with a focus on digital tools for science and her label Access to Perspectives. She aims at strengthening global science communication in general, and with a regional focus on Africa through open science. So welcome, Dr. Joe. We weren't sure if you were going to be here, so we do have a recording ready in case, but just let us know if you'd rather present online right now or if you'd rather us play the recording.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for having us. I'm actually at another conference in Kampala at the moment, also facilitating a workshop, so I would appreciate if you could play the recording. And yes, my colleague Ebuka Ezeke is not in the room at the moment, but he can join the room probably through the public link and then answer any questions that you might have on our behalf for Africa Archive. And the recording should also inform on all the things I wanted to share with you.
Thank you so much for coming and stopping by and just saying hello.
Sure. And I wish I could have been at the venue also the last 2 days, but I'm very excited that you're facilitating this hybrid approach that we can participate anyways.
Good. Well, we hope you enjoy the rest of your conference, and also if you stick around, we'd love to hear more from you afterwards. But we'll invite people to, share their ideas and opinions nonetheless and share the recording with you. So thanks for coming. Okay. As for the attendees, without further ado, we're going to be playing the presentation recording that Dr. Joe had shared with us in advance. So thanks.
Hello, my name is Joe Haverman. I'm a training consultant for Access to Perspectives based in Germany and consulting for open science and science communication. I'm greeting you together with Professor Mudara Ogot, the CEO of UbuntuNet Alliance from Kampala, Uganda, where there is currently a parallel conference happening, the UbuntuNet Connect annual event. UbuntuNet Alliance is the regional NREM for Southern and Eastern Africa, and together with UbuntuNet Alliance and Access to Perspectives, we are we're governing and coordinating Africa Archive, the African Open Access and Preprint Repository as a data repository, which I'll tell you more about today. So our mission is to make African research discoverable together with partners from all around the world, and especially African stakeholders. Our website can be explored, africarchive.org. You can explore our website also in part in Arabic. Otherwise, we have localized it through Google Translate to those supported languages that are spoken on the continent. So you find also traditional African languages. And we have, a couple of years ago, we postulated 10 principles for open access that are specific and relevant to the region. And the first principle goes such that academic research and knowledge from and about Africa should be freely available to all who wish to access, use, and reuse it, while at the same time being protected from misuse and misappropriation. The challenges that we address at the same time through our work are circumventing language barriers, basically we're increasing the visibility of digital research output from African scholars. The challenge that African researchers are underrepresented in international networks can be circumvented by the networking opportunities that arise for visibility of the output, and the restricted access to research funding hopefully will also be mitigated through exposure of the scholarly achievements made in the region. So the beneficiaries of our activities are researchers, publishers, and libraries, or librarians alike, through reputation building, networking opportunities, and capacity building and discoverability, or increased discoverability of the research output by institutions and by individuals. Here's a snapshot of our submission portal page, or how to submit, where since our launch in 2018, we have been working with affiliate repositories, namely the Node Share, OSF, Open Science Framework, and PopUp, in order to make African research output measurable by numbers. And each of these platforms allows to set up a community or collection, which we label for Africa Archive, and then encourage African scholars to submit their work to these platforms into our collection, so that we can showcase African specific output explicitly. We have moderation set up for all of these platforms to be able to ensure quality, and the platforms provide digital object identifier assignment for each submitted item, and also have integrations with ORCID and other persistent identifiers as feasible, and ensure indexing and scholarly search databases for the sake of discoverability. So with the Ubuntu Alliance now this year, we're setting up locally hosted open source infrastructure for scholarly output. We're starting with DSpace, and over the course of the next couple of years, we'll also add Dataverse, PKP's Open Journal System, and Vineo RDM, and then looking towards others, in order to, because some of these services are already used to certain degrees by various institutions across the continent, and we want to be able to provide capacity building through by learning, but also providing educational resources for librarians and researchers alike, how to make best possible use of features that each of these systems provides, and also provide storage space in the UbuntuNet Open Science Cloud, so that individual researchers can submit their work to any of these systems, to a central repository, which is an Africa Archive, but institutions can also adopt any of these systems for their own use, to own their own research output, and work with us to basically speed up the process and make it most efficient as possible for time and HR commitment. And also affordable, of course. So by centralizing the service, but also allowing for adoption at the institutional level, we make the services most possibly affordable and also efficient. That's the announcement for the UbuntuNet Connect conference where you currently find us. I hope I'll be able to join you for the Q&A, connectivity allowing. But in the next couple of minutes, allow me to share with you a few examples of our projects and initiatives. So Decolonized Science, or rather Decolonizing Scientific Writing for Africa, is a project that we're working with Khalifa, Science Link, and ST Communications. These are three institutions who have specialized in translating scholarly content and also science communication. The translations are done of actually 230 research articles altogether. And so the articles were translated first into a lay summary and then into 6 traditional African languages, which we are currently busy with our team at Africa Archive to curate into the database, which you can find on our website. So under Decolonising Scientific Writing for Africa. So so basically you can then search through the language and then find all these articles in the respective translation with a link to the original article published that was published, and also with linkages to the other translations into other languages. And these are examples on how this then looks in the search field, where you have Hausa, Sotho, Zulu, Luganda, Yoruba, Amharic for the specific articles with the title in that language, but also a linkage to the original article published on the DOI, as mentioned. We support diamond open access in Africa in various ways as a means for affordable free to publishing for researchers and affordable publishing venues for institutions like diamond open access journals. And we do that in 2 ways: by encouraging universities and university libraries to set up university presses or to leverage the ones they already have, and by supporting African journals for them to explore possibilities to switch to diamond open access. And we work with, in doing so, we plan to work with and have also already in the past worked with the organizations that draw the African Journals Online, pre-review, IDA Africa, Notify, or the Coalition of Open Access Repositories, and the Notify Project, and the Association of University Presses. So these are all organizations who are playing a role, or a central role in this initiative. And we hope to tap into making this a focus of our work for the next couple of years to expand diamond open access and expertise in the region of Africa. Wikipedia, you can find a list of university presses from around the world, and these are the ones that are up and running in Africa. This is an overview, and I just want to point out that JISC has developed a new university press toolkit where they encourage and also describe the setup of university presses in the most affordable and efficient way possible using digital tools, and you can access that on the website. We are currently this year, we are so lucky to be amongst the recipients of the ORCID Global Participation Program, or the fund that was is being distributed, which you can also apply to because it's being shared out, it's being disseminated twice a year. And as grantees for this year, we are encouraging the adoption of persistent identifiers and explicitly ORCID for the reasons mentioned before, and to foster best possible discoverability and indexing in open scholarly databases. We have, as a key deliverable of this grant, we have developed or launched a webinar series, to which you're most welcome to join any of our sessions. They're ongoing and will also be announced with individual sessions also until 24. And the featured organizations that the webinars are focusing on are listed on the site. So the PKP data site, the various pictures, so basically also many of our partners. And these are all institutions who either look into or provide open science, open source, so both in either or digital infrastructure, or are working towards making that work for the region of Africa. And we also discuss which of these services are also already covering African stakeholders and African research items, and how we can increase discoverability within these services for Africa. And this is an example of a past webinar session in which we discussed the adoption of ORCID in Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Nigeria, with Lambe, Owen, Cecile, and Penina. And the recordings of all sessions are being made available on our website and the webinars. Another initiative which we have set up, and you can explore on our website and also reach out to us on how to do that for your own region and institution, is country profiles, which could also be set up for institution profiles. And what we do here is for each country in Africa, we have basically compiled, or we're bringing these services together which showcase and allow for exploration of scholarly research output and open access adoption over time, and for the case of COKI. So each of these organizations displays open access and actual research output per region, or per country in this case. For example, we had a project in 2020 and 2021 where we were mapping institutional repositories in Africa, which you can find in the first column. And this map then allows you to identify the institutional repository, for example, in this case, Zimbabwe, and then click through on the website and find the actual repository posted online, and then you can search through the research items that they have on display. An alternative to Scopus or Web of Science is the Lens as a literature discovery tool, and we have set up collections for each country, which you can explore as well. And then COKI provides information on open access adoption over time for the African countries and institutions in these. A job is being added as we speak for the African journals that exist in each country, and fair sharing is a registry of data policies and data repositories, which also we're also working with to make African data policies and registries and repositories more accessible and put them in their display. The partners that we work with is Africa Archive listed here. It's received and continue to receive project funding from different organizations. And you are cordially invited to reach out to Mandara Gott or myself if you would like to hear more about Africa Archive or engage with us to explore further what we can do to increase discoverability of research output from the MENA region, and in our case, in particular, Africa. Of course, there's some overlap with Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, and other countries. So yeah, thanks for listening, and we're looking forward to an engaging discussion.
Well, that was a wonderful presentation that was given to us by Dr. Joe Haverman. I want to thank you all for tuning in. We now have a Q&A portion of the webinar or this session. So I'd like to invite our speakers who are already here to turn on their cameras and to turn on their mics so you can join us. And we're just going to wait just a moment for Dr. Joe's colleague to also join us for the panel. Our colleagues over on the tech side of things are just upgrading his position. So that should happen shortly. But in the meantime, I suppose we can just begin with a couple of questions. Thank you both, first of all, so much for everything that you've shared. I feel like we've really gotten a lot of, here we go, wonderful. We've really gotten so much insight today into how all of these different platforms are being used, where they're being used, by who are they being used. And I think there's been a lot of quantifiable, information that really helps us gauge what the world of open access and the broader world of research and scientific research and output looks like. But in the name of, this year's open access theme, which Dr. Dani mentioned to us, community over commercialization, and also in the spirit of the name of this panel, the first thing that I sort of want to hand over to the speakers for us to kind of chew on or think about, or maybe you have an answer for it, which would be incredible, is the word decolonization in itself. It's kind of become a bit of a buzzword, in my opinion, in not just in the world of scholarship and academia, but across the board. People often use this word to describe, things that are sort of more within the framework of inclusivity or diversity, metrics, rather than actually targeting decolonization at its core. And I think I'm kind of just interested in knowing what you sort of, believe or think about that, and the fact that this word within academia now is so often co-opted, when in reality, I think, in my personal opinion, decolonization is actually not very good for business. If we're really talking about it, there's this kind of goal to try and give us like decolonization light, which is that there's still funding, there's still, some kind of profitability, there's still all of these things, but, we're just sort of including other people into the conversation. So I'd like to hear more on your perspectives, just starting with that. It's free for anyone to jump in on. You're all muted, so just in case anyone is about to jump on. Okay, one
of the thoughts that I had about that was that I think Tuck and Wong had a paper come out a decade ago which spoke about decolonization specifically in terms of land occupation, and any other forms of using the phrase decolonization are essentially discounting the fact that land occupation is a much more serious problem which has happened over centuries in the past. But I feel that given the extensive digitization of human lives in the last 2 decades, colonization could happen in much more insidious ways. Virtual state propaganda is just one example, for instance, which we have been noticing in rather recently in cases of misinformation, or when there's a conflict, you see about the same fact, you will see information represented in 2 very different ways. So, and I think in terms of scholarly research, a consistent lack of recognition for knowledge which is being actively generated in certain parts of the world, it seems like a colonizing feature to me. So I would still consider that to be colonization that needs to be decolonized in today's digital age.
Absolutely. Dr. Dani or Mr. Abuka, please feel free to jump in.
I am very aware that I'm a white face here. So, but I think that colonisation, and I understand what you're saying there about the land question, but if we move into this the conversation around scholarly communication, I think often we're talking about power and the people who get to make the rules.
Absolutely.
And the rules are currently very, I mean, the observation of the work that Saurabh put together about how poorly Scopus indexes material from the PKP material is really indicative of the problem, because those indexes are the ones that are used for our most beloved ranking systems of universities around the world, for example, that are the ones that then say, well, this is a good university and this is a not so good university. And so if we've got a large proportion or even a majority of material and publications not actually included in the index that's used to make those assessments, then it's a ridiculous assessment. And that comes down to this question of power, and also comes down to this question of colonisation in a different form. We've got a very concentrated situation of really, we're almost down to 3 companies in the world that are really controlling the research infrastructure and research assessment processes, and that they're making decisions on behalf of the entire world scholarly communication ecosystem that we're kind of not privy to. And so it's sort of colonisation all over again in a different way. It's very concerning, and I think that we really do need to be talking about historical colonisation and current into the future colonisation as well.
Absolutely, I completely agree, and I think you've raised great points, both of you, especially about how people often describe decolonization or colonialism as a thing of the past, when in reality, these structures are very much still in place today. We've just given them, you know, a different name, a nicer face, a bow tie to wrap on top, but it's still very much still the same power dynamics. And I think what I find very interesting in these conversations is kind of, you know, talking about commodification of knowledge, and it's also the westernization of knowledge. Oftentimes we only really talk about it from the North, and we talk about how there's a lot of knowledge production happening in the North that's very biased and very, you know, westernized. But in reality, if we're really taking it back from a colonial perspective, colonization affected knowledge production in many countries. It affected the way that we produce knowledge, the way that we even think of knowledge. You know, in gender studies, the concept of objectivity in scientific research can be described as quite a patriarchal, you know, approach to knowledge. And so it's this discounting of other forms of knowing or ways of knowing. So I love what you've both have shared, and I completely agree with your sentiments. And I guess I'm wondering as well, because you've brought up the metrics and, you know, kind of how they have their own kind of colonial biases to them. Is there an entity or some kind of conversation happening about how we can form metrics that don't have that, or that are like anything that's actively working to decolonize metric systems and the idea of quality research in academia? Please don't feel like you have to hate yourselves, by the way, while in this conversation. It's very much a discussion. So jump in whenever you want to. Don't if you don't.
We are talking about very large concepts and very challenging ones to counter. But something that I think is quite important is the idea of open infrastructure, and all 3 of the presentations today are talking about open infrastructure. So providing an alternative mechanism for research to be able to be generated and captured and shared is, I think that's a really important activity that needs to happen and be supported, because without that, the only option we have is the commercial option, and that commercial option is so heavily skewed and has no interest in changing its ways. Why would you? It's extremely successful. So commercially, so I really feel that open infrastructure is where we need to be focusing our energy.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Saurabh, sorry, I'm gonna get it right someday, I promise. But
No, I think I agree with that sentiment too. It's I think the least we could do in terms of metrics would be just looking at where the articles that we read as researchers are coming from. I think if you are conscious of the fact that you are reading everything from Western journals, then you naturally might be inclined to fish for information in other contexts. But at the same time, I also want to be conscious of the fact that I think there's Goodhart's law, which mentions that when a metric becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So we should not be targeting metrics that, oh, this is the metric that gives us diversity, or this is the one that does not, because if we do that, we end up entering another downward spiral, which we have seen with things like citation counts or H-index, and these are heavily skewed metrics because you will not find citations at all for a lot of journals, which are, if their presence is not acknowledged, then it's very likely that the articles inside them are not cited, and then you have a very skewed distribution of citations, and hence every metric is skewed. So I think probably like the best way is to be conscious of like what you consume the information as a researcher, and try to actively seek out diverse opinions around a certain topic, and see if there's research coming out from different parts of the world or in different languages, and not just in English, and not just the US or Western Europe.
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also recognizing that just because because I have a question on representation that I hope I'll get to ask, but I think we're already running out of time, so maybe we'll take this on Slack. But I think also acknowledging that, you know, just because if my name is Nahil Nassar, I'm Egyptian, if I have my name on a paper, someone might say, oh, well, then this is, you know, this is research from the Global South. This is great. We're going to use this. It's diverse. It's wonderful. But I am not a representative. So also acknowledging that academics in their own right can have biases, even from the Global South, and to maybe understand and appreciate that decolonizing knowledge is more of a conceptual, you know, issue, and something that we need to address from a more like moral values based, rather than always just putting it on a person. I don't think I'll have time to ask all the questions, so I'll just ask one that maybe leaves us on.
Hi, Nahil.
Hi, sorry.
Yeah,
yes,
sorry.
Can
I just
Yes.
Yeah,
please.
thank you. Can I just say something as regards decolonization?
Yes, please.
Okay. In my own opinion, I feel it's mainly about promoting indigenous research work and knowledge, especially when it comes to underrepresented regions such as Africa. And when we talk about decolonization, it has to do with promoting research works from, like I said, African region, and not just the research work in general, but also promoting the languages from this region and using them in the research process. So that's what I feel about that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's why the work of all of these infrastructures that Dr. Danny and Saurabh have mentioned are so valuable. And it may be slow rolling. It may be, you know, I saw your question in the Q&A box asking about the African country languages that are represented. And, you know, I think knowing that there are institutions or there are organizations that are at least working to get there, you know, is something quite large. I completely agree with your sentiments. My last question that I wanted to ask was just to leave us on a positive note, sort of. You've all kind of referenced here or there, and for the last 2 days, we've been hearing a lot of references to Indonesia and its success as an open access, you know, country. I think, Saurabh, you mentioned 81% of journals or something along those lines. So I wanted to ask if you think there are any takeaways. I know every country has its own context, and that's something to remember as well for decolonizing purposes. So not to just copy paste models, but are there any takeaways that we can potentially learn from in terms of their success, how they got there, what kind of support they needed, so on and so forth?
I think one of the things that I think that works in Indonesian universities is that we have so the university system encourages even undergraduate students to publish their research or thesis in some kind of a journal. So it's not a system that's encouraging professors or PhD graduates to do things. It's a system that's maybe built from the ground up. So even as an undergraduate or a master's student, you are in that system of publishing your research in a relatively open environment. So maybe that's the kind of, and a lot of undergraduate students would not have access to research if it's behind paywalls. So maybe that's a system that's like a good reinforcement cycle for each other. So maybe that's one of the learnings that we could try to emulate in other contexts.
Absolutely.
Yes, I think you're right there. I think that it's the normalization of open access, and one of the conversations, because this week's been Open Access Week and lots of discussions and about different aspects of open access. And one of the questions is the question of prestige and open
What a word.
publications as prestigious, you know, and so. And that then comes back to who controls. But if the decision is that it is normal for everybody to be making their work openly available, and in fact, if you don't, there's something a bit odd about you. That's a very different perspective to the I must publish in Fancy Pants Journal A, and I don't care about the open access or not side of things, because it's all about the prestige. So I think it sort of comes back to the assessment system, and this is something I want to dig into in my new position, is talk much more to my Indonesian colleagues about. I've had some conversations. I want to understand further about how it really works on the ground, because it does seem to be just a much more open conversation about openness there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And who knows, maybe one of the organizations sitting here today might be the one to take charge of creating a metric system that's a bit more I don't want to say the word inclusive, I kind of hate that word personally, but more globally, conscious. How about we leave it at that one? So thank you. I don't know if Mr. Abuka, if you have any more comments to make before I wrap up. I want to give you the chance to jump in.
No, I don't have any other. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, in that case, thank you all so much for joining us. A special thank you to our speakers, of course, for being a part of this. My eyes feel like they're glittering with joy. I loved having this conversation with both of you. And I think a lot of people are going to be very excited to get the recording for this.